Konnichiwa! Welcome back to the Retro Game Boy channel. This is the second part of our fanboy throwback to the 16-bit console wars, where we ask which console was the best, the Super Nintendo or the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis. In last week's show, we firmly had our Sega fanboy hats on as we laid down the facts for the Sega Genesis. And you can watch that one-sided bias show by clicking on this link right here. For today's show, we'll have our Nintendo fanboy hats on, and we'll be travelling back to the 90s to lay out why there is no question in our mind that the Super Nintendo Entertainment System was the best gaming system, the best 16-bit gaming system for any of your gaming needs. Let's get into this. Game on! Welcome back to the show. My name's Mike, and by day I'm a AAA games developer, but at night I'm a retro gaming fanboy. If you're a 16-bit fanboy or girl, then make sure you hit that thumbs up button as we jump thumbs first into why the Super Nintendo obliterates Sega and the Sega Genesis with its Super Nintendo. We don't have to fluff this video out with words, we've got facts. Facts as to why the Super Nintendo was light years ahead of the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. And we're going to start with an easy win for the Super Nintendo, the graphics. So it's true that the Sega Mega Drive did have a 7.67 MHz processor, and the Sega fanboys love to lord this over us Super Nintendo owners. But whilst the SNES did have a 2.68 MHz processor, it only took 2 to 3 clock cycles to complete a single instruction, whereas the Mega Drive could take up to 8 cycles to complete an instruction. This meant that both systems operated almost virtually on par with each other.
Now you're playing with power. Super power.
Our awesome Super Nintendo also had double the RAM, 128 kilobytes, versus the Genesis' pitiful 64 kilobytes. And Nintendo continues to destroy the Sega console with over 32,000 colours, 256 that could be displayed at once. The Mega Drive had 512, and it can only display 64 colours at once. So your SNES could display a richness of colour 4 times greater than that of your Sega fanboy friends. The SNES also brought a number of amazing technical innovations to the 16-bit era. Now, programmers of the Super Nintendo had 8 video modes available to them, 0 to 7. Now, by far the most public facing of these graphical modes was Mode 7. Now, this mode allowed developers to take a layer and rotate and scale it, giving the illusion of a 3D effect. The utilization of this mode led to some stunning games like Super Mario Kart, F-Zero and Pilot Wings. The SNES also had the FX chip developed by Argonaut. This code processor actually sat inside the cartridge and allowed developers to render out polygons and improve 2D effects. This technology in Nintendo's cartridges was light years ahead of the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, and spoiled games like Star Fox and later Doom with the FX chip too. Doom on a Super Nintendo. The only way Sega could manage to get Doom on their console was if you spent $150 on a mushroom-shaped console that sat on top of your Mega Drive. And even then, it wasn't a huge leap over the Super Nintendo version, even though it had a so-called 32-bit processor inside it. Let's face it, Sega fanboys, you're living in an absolute fantasy if you think your games look anywhere near as good as our games on the Super Nintendo. Audio. This is not even worth talking about. The Mega Drive had 6 channels of audio with 8 kilobytes of audio RAM or SRAM. The SNES had 8 channels of audio and 64 kilobytes of SRAM. SMP dedicated audio chip inside the Super Nintendo here gave a richness of sound that the Mega Drive and Genesis just couldn't hope to achieve, and gave us amazing soundtracks like these. The SNES not only had the best looking games, but also the best sounding games, while the Genesis was stuck in the dark ages with blips and blobs. The SNES was a well-designed, solid console with clean lines and a pleasing symmetrical design. Its eject button was simplistic and genius, unlike the Genesis where you had to tug and pull like a Neanderthal just to get your game out of the console. The build quality was leagues ahead of the Genesis. With the poor plastic used in the Sega Mega Drive, it used to creak and groan as you used to pull that cartridge out of the top slot. But the crown jewel for the Super Nintendo is its joypad. Unlike the last gen 3-button layout of the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo had 4 face buttons. These were excellently placed and made intuitive button combos for developers a reality. The coloured buttons on the PAL SNES controller also made it possible for UI artists and designers to bring those colours into the design and UI interface of the games themselves. It had a start and select button and 2 shoulder buttons as well, all of which are now commonplace in our current gen console controllers. The greater number of buttons on the Super Nintendo joypad meant that developers, in a very real way, could increase the number of player action features. SNES players could literally do more with their characters on screen than their Sega friends could with their Sega Genesis. And with arcade games moving away from the old school 2 and 3 button layouts to new 6 and 8 button layouts, the SNES was perfectly placed for any brand new arcade ports. Now when we look at the poor old Sega Mega Drive owner and their 3-button layout joypad, it meant that they couldn't take the control systems of these brand new arcade games. Instead, they had to come up with these weird and awkward button configurations to allow them to play these games. Arcade games like Golden Axe, where you didn't have a run button, you had to tap and then tap and hold for your character to run. Or most famously of all, Street Fighter 2, where you had to press start to switch between your punches and your kicks. As Super Nintendo owners, we just played the game as it was designed to be played, with a single button for a single move. How anyone could seriously consider buying a Sega Genesis when it was handicapped in such a way is absolutely beyond me. Now, we do need to talk about game boxes. Yes, the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive did have plastic boxes. But what use are those plastic boxes when the games inside them are nowhere near as good as the Super Nintendo's 16-bit blockbuster catalogue? Now when it comes to games, Sega fanboys always make a big deal about their back catalogue of arcade games and sports titles. Let's get real here. Who cares about sports titles? Especially when they're released every 6 months. And old arcade games that are long past their sell-by date? Give me a break. The SNES had bigger and better games. The best 16-bit game catalogue ever seen. Some of the biggest games the biggest franchises and games that are still around today. Games like The Legend of Zelda, my all-time favourite game series ever. The home of JRPGs, games like Final Fantasy, any Mario game, Starwing, Doom, Donkey Kong, Metroid. The list of original titles just goes on and on and on. It's all about games with any console, and the absolute truth of the matter is that the Super Nintendo just had the best games for any 16-bit console. And that's why the Super Nintendo is better than the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. The SNES changed the face of the gaming world forever with its stunning games catalogue, amazing graphical power and bleeding edge audio, and a joypad that was a game changer for gamers. Now don't be upset, Sega fanboys, your console tried, but ultimately it fell well short of the pure awesomeness of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. And that's the end of our two-part show where we take a fanboy's perspective and the facts and compare the Super Nintendo with the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis. Now hopefully this hasn't been too harrowing for you and that any fights in the comments below that broke out have been resolved. The fact is that both of these consoles will hold a special place in gamers' hearts. The games, graphics, sounds, even the controllers. These two 16-bit giants helped bring the golden age of gaming to our households. Now if you enjoyed these shows or love retro gaming, then why not consider subscribing to the Retro Gamer Boy Show by clicking on my little pixel head below. Now I do retro gaming shows every week, and if you don't want to miss out on your retro gaming, then make sure you click on the little bell below. And if next week is too long for you to wait, then you can click on one of these two videos over here.